thanks very much. Just for the record, that I've been working on that book for quite a while. So I may have to change the title. I'm very wedded to that title, but we'll see whether that emerges. So thank you very much, Farina and the University of Michigan and South Asia Center for inviting me. It's really an honor. People always say that, but it's actually true in this case, especially to be associated with so many courageous activists and wise intellectuals who know so much about South Asia and social justice. So to be among you is really great. I would also like to dedicate this paper to the memory of my friend Vijay Nagaraj, who recently, much too young, died in an accident in Sri Lanka. I dedicate it to him because he was a South Asian rights activist, but also one with global reach, an incredible mind, doing some really excellent work in Sri Lanka last year. And I think my paper would have been much better if he had been around to read it. So I think some of you might know he was a really interesting, special person. So in what follows, I'll try to map out some of the complicated relationships in post-war Sri Lanka between the country's multiple lines of conflict and multiple intertwined forms of injustice, and to try to explore why attempts to respond to these injustices are so often faced with contradictions. The paper is very much a work in progress. It's a preliminary attempt to explore the obstacles at work in the role of the international. By that I mean international organizations, foreign governments, multilateral organizations, and ideas of international justice and of the international community. And the role of all of that in searching for justice. I'll be looking particularly at what I'm calling ethnic justice, and also a little bit at economic justice in a longer version of the paper that I've had to chop down. I was also looking at some ideas of the liberal rule of law, judicial sort of classic work for the courts, which would have resonated with some of what we've already seen. So these ideas of the international are associated both with justice, the justice that the Sri Lankan state has failed to deliver, especially to its non-majority peoples, Tamil and Muslims, but also with injustice for many people in Sri Lanka, thanks to the perceived favoritism of the international towards one community, its double standards, and its selective vision of justice. So as I do this, I'll try to be reflecting on my own role as a longtime observer and sometimes resident of Sri Lanka who works for an international NGO that often speaks and acts from within the framework of the international. So first, just some basic sort of scene setting for Sri Lanka, since I realize that not everyone follows Sri Lanka quite as closely as I do. So as is true across South Asia, social justice in its various forms in Sri Lanka has been overshadowed and made more difficult to achieve by the majoritarian definition of the polity and state, and the ethnic and religious conflicts that this has fueled. Since gaining independence from the British in 1948, Sri Lanka has been riven by competing nationalisms, as the state quickly took on the job of institutionalizing the dominance of the Sinhalese majority, who are mostly Buddhist, make up about 70-75% of the population, over Tamil and smaller Muslim minorities. The electoral assertion of majoritarian identity politics was in part a response to the advantages that Tamils in various ways had gained under the British, and more broadly to Sri Lanka's 500-year experience of Western colonialism, first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then the British. Tamil claims to constitute a nation deserving self-determination in the areas of their historical habitation in the north and the east of the island, was sort of the counter to and in part produced by the majoritarian definition of the state. So by the early 1980s, state repression of Tamil claims had provoked violent resistance, with the Tamil Tigers, otherwise known as the LTTE, emerging as the dominant Tamil militant group fighting to establish a separate state of Tamil in the north and the east, and frequently appealing to the international community to redress the power imbalance within the island. So periods of war and failed peace talks followed, with growing ferocity and atrocity on all sides, and liberal and democratic institutions under assault by the government and the LTTE alike. ending in a bloodbath in which tens of thousands of Tamil civilians were killed in just the first 5 months of 2009. The war left a bitter legacy and demands for justice. Even as the defeat of the LTTE brought to an end the limited political leverage that its military power had provided the Tamils. 6 years of authoritarian and triumphalist Sinhala nationalist rule followed under the victorious president, Mahinda Rajapaksa. Even as pressure for political reforms and for accountability for the war crimes that both sides committed at the end of the war grew from both Western governments and even India, which is normally reticent to raise human rights issues in other countries. Following Rajapaksa's surprise defeat, a national unity government came to power in 2015, so 2.5 years ago, thanks to a cross-ethnic reform coalition that drew in Tamils, Muslims, and Sinhalese. The government promised wide-ranging reforms, most of which involved significant roles for international actors and for international institutions. But together they faced serious contradictions. So the most important of its promises were, first, a series of transitional justice institutions to deal with the past and the legacy of the war and to support interethnic reconciliation, in particular, a truth commission, a special court to prosecute war crimes, and offices for missing persons and for reparations. That was the first set of promises. Also promised a new constitution, likely to include provisions for greater devolution of power to provinces, particularly to the north and east, to the northern and eastern provinces, where Tamils have formed the majority for many years. Reforms to reestablish the rule of law, including through independent investigations of political crimes, corruptions under the previous rule. And finally, economic policies to re-energize the economy through reducing the role of the state, expanding trade, and further integrating into the global economy. Sri Lanka's political transition, however, appears increasingly thin. The government has so far been unwilling to challenge or rework in any serious way the state's dominant Sinhala nationalist framework. It appears to believe that dealing with the past poses too big a political risk vis-a-vis Sinhala voters, who make up the vast majority of the population. And its promises of transitional justice at the UN Human Rights Council seem principally to have been designed to reduce international political pressure and to win time for international economic development assistance and economic relief of various sorts. So that's the background. So of the various forms of justice currently in play in Sri Lanka, what I'll call ethnic justice has dominated international discourse and engagement, both now and in the past. International attention and concern has focused principally on Tamils as victims of structural marginalization and as the principal, though not the only, victims of the war that was fought to challenge this marginalization. That said, it's important to note that Sinhalese suffered immensely from the war too, including through LTTE attacks on civilians, as did Sri Lanka's Muslims, who have suffered from marginalization and abuse from both Tamil and Sinhala nationalisms. And also suffering from the LTTE, is important to note, were Tamils who disagreed with the LTTE, Tamil dissidents and intellectuals and independent thinkers. Now, throughout the war, global powers consistently backed the Sri Lankan state against the LTTE insurgency, with decades of economic and military support, even as they spoke out, at least in principle, in favor of a just settlement. Equally important to note, however, is that Sinhala nationalism sees itself too as part of continuing a just struggle against colonialism and neo. While proponents of international engagement and pressure see these as needed to equalize an asymmetrical power relationship within the island, the dominant strand of Sinhala political thinking is long seen as one-sided and pro-Tamil, even pro-separatist, but international attempts, including those by India in the late 1980s, to secure a just settlement of the ethnic conflict for the national questions. This is even more pointedly true with regard to the possibility of a war crimes court, again, as agreed by the Sri Lankan government to the UN Human Rights Council in 2015, in response to years of US-led pressure, as well as quite a damning report by the UN Human Rights Office in 2015. Especially controversial within Sri Lanka have been demands for a so-called hybrid court to include foreign judges, which was called for in an idea endorsed by the UN High Commission. International involvement by its proponents, however, is seen as necessary to ensure independent and credible trials in a system dominated by Sinhalese officials and judges, and that has provided virtually no justice for the scores of military atrocities against Tamil civilians over the decades. However, facing strident calls by the political opposition led by the former President Rajapaksa, in the name of defending Sri Lanka's war heroes who are seen as having defeated ruthless terrorists, the LTTE. In this context, the government has backed off its promises of justice, making no moves to establish a special court and rejecting the idea of foreign judges being involved. Government supporters, including many Western diplomats, increasingly see the two key forms of ethnic justice that have been promised at odds. That is to say, many now accept the government's argument that dealing with wartime violations, especially through a court that could see prosecutions of the military, the fear now is that this could provoke so much resistance among Sinhalese that it will undermine any chance that Sinhalese voters would accept any forward-looking constitutional changes to grant Tamil majority areas more powers. In such a case, so the argument goes, it's better to focus on a new constitution, on forward-looking changes, and the forms of justice that could provide, which will need approval in a referendum and therefore a majority of the Sinhalese population, and hope at least to win one battle rather than trying to win, to go for all forms of justice and fail on all of it. For other reasons too, however, Western governments have in fact ceased to push very hard on legal accountability for war crimes. The same geopolitical considerations, which were chiefly about growing Chinese influence in Sri Lanka, which encouraged Western governments and India to use demands for accountability as leverage against the former government, which ultimately did help assist in Rajapaksa's electoral defeat in 2015. These same concerns are now leading Western governments and India to treat Sri Lanka gently, offering them significant economic support and renewing previously strained military ties. So again, that's all a bit more sort of up-to-date context. Working from outside of Sri Lanka to right the ethnic imbalance of power in its justice system would always be very difficult in the best of cases. But the traction of international appeals and pressure for justice and human rights is weakened by a range of important contradictions, which I want to just try to explore. So one key obstacle, perhaps an obvious one, if you look at the news around the world today, is the long-standing refusal of powerful states, including ostensible human rights supporters in the West, to allow themselves to be held accountable for their own violations. And the inability of the global human rights community to change this dynamic. So this problem worsened considerably after the attacks of 9/11 and the sanction that Al-Qaeda's violence gave to counterterrorism policies by Western governments that routinely violated international law. This had direct effects in Sri Lanka, where India and US tolerated quite brutal methods used to eliminate the LTTE. More recently, there's been a notable shift, as I think everyone has noted it, from what you might call liberal hypocrisy to right-wing, complete disregard and disdain for human rights concerns. With authoritarian nationalist regimes in the US and in India, parts of the EU, all joining Russia and China and other authoritarian powers, and increasingly giving up any pretense of being bound by international humanitarian human rights law. The refusal of big states to allow themselves to be held accountable has made it increasingly hard to hold to account small states like Sri Lanka, even when those big states want to, and even harder when they don't. So these contradictions or these double standards strengthens the counter vision of justice as sovereignty vis-a-vis unfair foreign pressure, which appeals to the common sense idea of justice as requiring the same standards to apply to all countries. So throughout Sri Lanka's civil war, and afterwards, in fact, government officials and Sinhala nationalist commentators would routinely point out the double standards whereby US and Western militaries and intelligence agencies took many of the same actions that those governments would denounce as rights violations when done by Sri Lanka. More recently, for instance, the justice minister was responding to criticism from UN human rights specialists In fact, I think this particular was the special rapporteur on torture. The justice minister said, quoted Theresa May, Prime Minister of Britain, saying, "Oh no, we're not going to," speaking to her sort of nationalist British constituency, we won't let our soldiers be taken to any human rights, to the Hague or to any sort of international prosecutions. So the Sri Lankan justice minister said, "Well, what's good for the British is good for the Sri Lankans." Similarly, soon after Donald Trump's victory, President Sirisena, current president of Sri Lanka, announced that he would immediately write to Donald Trump, welcoming his election and requesting that he end the U.S. policy of requiring justice for war crimes in Sri Lanka. We never found out what exactly Trump said, but I'm sure if the letter ever got to him, he would be fine with this. At a deeper level, Western states' interventions in the name of minority rights and ethnic justice are, I think, undermined by their refusal to acknowledge in an open and thoughtful way their own colonial pasts, their own struggles to square their stated principles with their treatment of their own minorities and indigenous people, both in the past and the future. So their appeals to justice in other countries are done either as if their own pasts never happened, or as if any injustice in the past had been fully accounted for and repaired, which we know is not the case. As a result, Western states' interventions are easily dismissed from within a country like Sri Lanka as self-righteous and as asking other countries to meet standards unattainable. So, where does all this put what I've been studying over the years and have been involved with in my specific niche in Sri Lanka and outside Sri Lanka? Let's say civil society organizations, particularly human rights and related justice-oriented NGOs, community-level organizations in Sri Lanka. With respect to human rights concerns, transitional justice and ethnic justice more generally, the efforts of civil society and non-governmental organizations, unfortunately, struggle to escape the shadow of states and the contradictions of the international system. So first, the double standards and moral failings of states would matter less if there were independent forms of leverage for Sri Lankan and international civil society forces to press the Sri Lankan government to change. But in practice, human rights-oriented civil society need to work through states and through state-dominated multilateral organizations, chiefly the UN, in order to put any effective pressure on a state like Sri Lanka. So they're non-governmental, but they have to work through governments, through the pressure that governments can bring, or through the pressure that multilateral organizations made up of governments can bring. In Sri Lanka's case, this has principally been the UN Human Rights Council. But working through and with diplomats and the arguments and frameworks that they consider politically realistic, civil society and rights groups inevitably get tarnished by the complicity and double standards of those states who support their demands for justice, however much those groups may at times criticize those things. So sort of working through the system that is a state system inevitably gets non-state actors mixed up in those same sort of contradictions. Related to this, I think the procedural dependence of domestic and global civil society on states and state-led multilateral organizations, especially the enforcement-weak UN Human Rights Council, is exacerbated by the financial dependence of many NGOs and advocates on those same states. That financial dependence allows donors considerable influence in setting the agenda of rights NGOs, who are routinely accused of being their cat's paws or their agents by nationalist politicians and groups in Sri Lanka, often ignoring the many criticisms that local and international rights NGOs make of those governments that fund them. Third, I think the focus of Sri Lankan groups and their international allies on international fora like the UN and advocacy targets has additional limitations and hidden costs. I would argue that the past few years' focus on the Human Rights Council in Geneva by Sri Lankan activists and by international organizations like mine that support their work and concern with Sri Lanka, that focus has physically taken activists away from Sri Lanka and from the hard work of convincing their fellow Sri Lankans, please Sinhalese, but not only, about the need for ethnic justice, either in the form of transitional justice or new, more rights-friendly constitution. So time spent doing advocacy among diplomats in Geneva has meant less time doing advocacy in Sri Lanka. And I think you can really feel the effect. As research in other locations has shown, though, dependence on the increasingly project-based funding of international donors has slowly transformed the organizational mode of much justice activism in ways I would argue limit their ability to reach very deep to Sri Lankan society. So rights-oriented NGOs would like to sort of be operating through a sort of a logic of deep solidarity and being part of a sort of global movement, social transformation, but in fact more often function according to sort of projects that are funded often by foreign governments and are managed by professionalized middle-class, generally English-speaking staff whose accountability ultimately is in many cases more to the donors, accountability in the form of reports, writing, saying literally we're accounting for the money and the support they've gotten, more than to the Sri Lankans whose rights they're championing. So this is a transformation that has happened across the world, I think, within civil society that has real costs. So foreign project-focused funding has changed the nature of the work, of what skills and connections are needed, and thus who can do it, and who therefore they are talking to and engaging with how. The middle class, professionalized, foreign-dependent, and often, as we've seen in Sri Lanka, foreign-oriented nature of so much rights activism makes it hard to engage, I argue, or engage effectively with average non-Colombo Sri Lankans, or with civil society, more broadly speaking, that is to say, trade unions, religious groups, professional associations. So often in Sri Lanka, NGOs, which are a very particular organizational model, call themselves civil society, but of course they're only a very small sliver of civil society. And actually the rest of civil society still needs to be convinced on a lot of issues. So the question is how to do that work better. And I think they are limited in part because of these financial, organizational sort of limitations. What comes with that is it's harder in particular to discuss economic and social injustice. So the social distance between elite, internationally connected, and non-elite sectors of civil society weakens the ability of the former to appeal to a wider constituency among Sinhalese, to draw out the links between ethnic justice on the one hand and economic justice and just the everyday social concerns of broader communities. Finally, among liberal international civil society, there is virtually no anti-colonialist or anti-neo-colonialist discourse in practice. And I think this might be a bit different. Sri Lanka might be a bit different than, say, other parts of South Asia. There's very little work that interrogates the continued legacy of colonialism or its resonance within Sri Lanka, or simply the existing unequal power relations between international and national groups, and between internationally connected and funded domestic groups, principally in Colombo, and their less connected, less well-funded compatriots outside the capital. To the extent that one hears any criticism of international and national power imbalances in civil society, it comes from pro-state singular nationalist forces who are very happy to point out much of what I'm doing. Of course, they're doing it, to serve a particular political agenda. But I guess what I'm arguing in part is to be more effective, so the liberal, cosmopolitan, internationally connected, and oriented civil society needs to take these criticisms seriously to make their own work effective. So this lack of sustained attention to economic and social rights is particularly striking with regard to what is perhaps the Sri Lankan government's highest current policy priority, its economic agenda of growth and prosperity through economic liberalization and fuller integration into global markets, through openness to foreign investment, through liberalizing labor and land markets, through the privatization and selling of state assets, through reducing the state and cutting the budget. Sounds familiar, other countries are doing similar things. These policy proposals, which are now just beginning to be implemented, are in part a response to undeniable economic difficulties, dangerously high debt levels, weak exports, foreign currency, low foreign currency reserves, high budget deficits, and a range of other challenges. Now, the government's inability so far to address people's social and economic needs has already increased support for a return of the Rajapaksa's and their nationalist mode of politics. Because many Sinhalese see them as competent. It's, yes, perhaps a bit thuggish, but they actually got things done. They built roads, they got jobs, etc. At the same time, however, so the government is under pressure on the one hand to start making some, sort of produce some economic benefits for the masses. But at the same time, however, there's a significant risk that liberalizing economic reforms will generate further social and economic inequalities and injustices, as we've seen in many parts of the world, which in turn could destabilize or play into the hands of the political opposition, with the people losing their jobs, their government jobs, reductions of subsidies, taxes, through a range of moves the government is considering. Now, while all this is happening, many of the same states and key international institutions that support or say they support international justice in its various forms also back the government's neoliberal economic strategy and have little serious to say about social justice and few strategies for really pro-poor or equitable growth. Indeed, foreign, including Western governments' interest in Sri Lanka is increasingly in the profit-making opportunities that it offers their corporations, particularly in the field of tourism, where, for instance, beachfront land is regularly acquired with illegal means. Now, this can be, this is just sort of one little anecdote without being unfair to this unnamed person, I think is worth telling. So the Obama administration's senior diplomat of South Asia, a very smart person, worked very hard to win Sri Lankan government backing for transitional justice and accountability. This person now works as a lobbyist for a U.S. hotel corporation and goes to Sri Lanka and tries to make deals for probably for beachfront property, which hopefully was acquired legally, but you never know. So to date, Sri Lanka's professional cosmopolitan civil society has had little to say about these dynamics and their potential ill effects on equality and social justice. While there are struggles, individual struggles to resist land seizures, for instance, by the military or sometimes by hotel corporations, and there are local level economic justice struggles that various community-based organizations, sometimes NGOs, are involved with. These are often ethnicized in the sense that Tamil organizations will be fighting land grabs in Tamil areas, Sinhala NGOs will be fighting Sinhalese areas. But there's been very little coordinated work and very little advocacy at the policy and the international level. That's to say, the kinds of work that NGOs would do, analyzing international law, going to the UN to lobby on a range of sort of war-related or ethnic-related justice issues. Very little of that similar kind of detailed policy interventions happen on economic issues. Now, I'd argue that the lack of control over these so this absence leaves the genuine economic concerns of non-elite Sri Lankans to the often cynical schemes of Sinhala nationalist politicians who are quick to link the supposed threats from international justice with those from international power. And the lack of control over internationalizing economic reforms and the lack of trust among most people that they will gain benefits from these reforms helps generate economic nationalism, which then feeds almost directly into political and ethnic nationalism. So Sri Lanka's left political parties, for instance, have a long history of resistance to economic imperialism. But this has often devolved into or apologized for rank Sinhala nationalism. And also, there's the case of the too violent uprising by the then Maoist People's Liberation Front, the JPP, which led to the deaths of tens of thousands, mostly at the hands of the police military, again in the name of sort of anti-colonial, anti-capitalist agenda. So there's this long tradition of sort of economic and political nationalism coming together. So just some concluding abstract, perhaps utopian thoughts about the possibility of a more democratic international environment. So tackling Sri Lanka's multiple justice deficits, particularly with regard to ethnic justice, is currently structured around a very simple paradox that international pressure seems both essential to sort of try to reorient the power imbalance within the island between the communities, and yet it also is counterproductive the same nationalism is trying to address, rejects it, and actually transforms the pressure into very useful ways for nationalist politicians. So my hunch is that if there's to be any chance of changing this dynamic, one would need to build a new, more democratic form of international. So what you currently have are the following elements. You have an international civil society, a set of NGOs, including the one I report, that rely on states for funding and/or to push through changes at various international levels through direct pressure on individual states, in Sri Lanka. But they do so with all the baggage of working through and with other states. They're working within their frameworks and on their assumptions and aiming at marginal change at best. Then you have national level liberal professional civil society with international and regional connections, but with funding limitations, either lack of funding or funding that comes with significant constraints, and severe class and democratic limitations, and generally very little interest in socioeconomic justice. Then you have other national level or local level civil society groups or some forms of civil society that may be engaged on socioeconomic rights, but which are either disinterested in ethnic justice, e.g. trade unions, professional groups, or actively hostile to it, thanks to Sinhala Buddhist identifications. Fourth, you'd have, yes, that's the third. So then what you don't have, though, is any kind of coherent international civil society supportive of both ethnic and economic justice, or horizontal and vertical inequalities, as they're sometimes called, with any independent financial basis and political traction, i.e. no effective democratic agent at the international or regional level that connects to, supports, learns from, and is supported by national and local level groups and parties. So any attempt to build such an international would face the necessity of, and the obstacles to, and perhaps the impossibility ultimately, of a fully self-reflexive practice of human rights in international good governance. So that's the idea I'm sort of toying with is, could you make all these sorts of interventions more self-reflective, more aware of their own contradictions and their own baggage and their own limitations? So if one were to try to do that, I think the key principles would have to be based on would be a recognition of the role played by ongoing economic injustices and power imbalances at the global level in favor of powerful countries and global elites, in the very instability and sort of bad governance that these states and multilateral organizations are trying to address in quote-unquote less developed countries. Also, recognition of the hypocrisy and double standards of various states, including Western, supposedly pro-human rights states, in and through the global war on terror. But also recognizing the widely shared fears that often drive the will to violence. Third, recognition of the power imbalances between donors and outside funders and outside power centers and local civil society groups, and between local elite groups and the rest of society that they're addressing and trying to move in a particular direction. Now, what the words that come to mind that might help here would be democracy and solidarity as antidotes to the lack of self-awareness and lack of self-critique that I think it runs to a large degree within various forms of civil society. And by this I mean, could we imagine popular, less state-dependent movements that build connections and networks of trust across different countries in support of democratic principles of equal rights in societies? Now, how these would in fact challenge ethno-nationalist attachments and conflict region remains the big question. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
We have until 3:30 for questions, and have a mic.
Thank you. That was really very interesting, and I have a couple questions. I think they are related. The first is to try and think about this point that you made, which is actually very unique for Sri Lanka. And I'm wondering if you have any response as to why that is the case. Is when you're talking about civil society organizations, you talk about the absence of a rhetoric, at least, of anti-colonialism, anti-neocolonialism. And it seems a little, and after you mentioned that, I think that is so true, but I hadn't ever thought of it like that. And I wonder if you had any explanation for that. And then the second, which is the post-Civil War scenario, the emphasis has been on bringing people to justice, right? And I wonder why there isn't another international discourse that we see also in play, which is not on bringing people to justice, but bringing about reconciliation. So you see that moving from, the U.S. South to South Africa, or vice versa, actually, and in a lot of communities, and even now in the wake of, anti-power protection lynchings in India, similar kind of effort, not on justice, but on reconciliation. So I wonder where that discourse is in your vision of a more democratic international.
Yeah, maybe.
And you make sure the mic is on. Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. Mine, I did have a question related to Minnie's, but now I'm going to move since she asked it. Because I was thinking about, in the morning we heard some people talk about the significance of the local, on the ground, the insiders. And I was wondering what, you laid out the problems of the so-called outsider to some extent, the internationals. And you laid out those problems really well. I'm wondering that's why we're talking about the crisis of the international in there. And I'm wondering whether we can think about, this is why I was thinking about South Africa, for instance. What happens when you talk internationally? What are the advantages of being, of operating on an international level, not just the local level? You talked about the problems of being, of operating from the outside as an international agent, and all the breakdowns that happen. But I'm wondering what the strengths might be of the international transmission.
I could add quickly to that. So you mentioned the first promise that the government made was around truth and reconciliation. And I remember about 3-4 years ago when this came out, virtually every leading newspaper article led with a South African model goes to Sri Lanka.
Right.
So if you could explain for us a bit more what exactly they picked up, because the South African model had a deep anti-colonial, anti-imperialist thing built into its very structure, and was also laced with a religious approach to questions of reparation. So how did those get either picked or dropped or adapted in some interesting way or the other? That would be helpful to understand. Maybe those 3 questions and then we'll come back.
Well, maybe I'll start with yours and then segue around. I mean, yeah, there's certainly many advantages. There's openings that you get at the international level. I mean, and there's some that have been directly beneficial to Sri Lankan actors. Having links to diplomats can save your life. They can get you out of the country. They can get you call to somebody who might want to kill you from a diplomat and leave you alive. So there's that. There's certainly many sometimes, and I think we've seen this in some of our other talks, sometimes international pressure can sort of twist the arms of a government like Sri Lanka to change the law. So maybe that might open up some space. And certainly, it's not like the space, the international is left the space in Sri Lanka is great, absolutely, and appeals to international law, to international organizations. Makes sense. I'm trying to sort of sketch out where they get into contradictions and whether reformulating with a more self-critical attitude from all angles might actually make it more but certainly, I mean, international pressure over many years through the Human Rights Council in New York, the Sri Lankan groups working with international groups like mine, or classic human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, changed international consensus that happened in Sri Lanka, put Sri Lankan diplomats, government officials on the defensive, and I think fed into led to a growing sense within Sri Lanka under the former government that the intransigence of the Rajapaksa government vis-a-vis international was beginning to hurt the country. And I think a certain section of single the voting population there's a cost to this aggressive nationalism. Maybe let's try another one. So international, the cumulative effect of international concern, pressure, probably contributed to the removal of a fairly authoritarian government. Now, whether that removal will be permanent or whether it's just sort of a temporary respite. Yeah, I don't really have the answer to the first part of your question. It's something I only began to think about writing these papers, is why the lack of I think it's partly, one answer would be just sort of a practical political party analysis, which would be, there's still a deep, there's deep division on left-right in Sri Lanka. So, and a lot of sort of professional, internationally oriented civil society in Sri Lanka would tend to be more aligned with the UNP, the somewhat, the right-wing pro-capitalist party, whereas the more left-wing parties, and especially the far left, still have this very much this very anti-imperialist rhetoric. Some often in very tired, very ineffective ways, but it's still their rhetoric, and they hate the UNP and they hate the sort of the capitalist sort of economic policy, the sort of hyper-capitalist economic policies of the UNP so much they've actually been willing to ally with Rajapaksa and his Sri Lankan Freedom Party, despite being uncomfortable with a lot of this very strongly nationalist politics. So I think sort of so basically, I guess I'm saying the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial rhetoric is sort of associated with one set of political actors, which tend not to be the sort of the milieu from which a lot of the international connected civil society comes from.
But can I just respond to that? Is it kind of related to your response to the earlier question, which is, has there been a sort of shift in Sri Lankan political and civil society discourse from a language of rights and representation to a language of entitlement and patronage? So the discourse that you're saying, you to call a diplomat and the diplomat calls and saves your life, that is a very different kind of political language. And that is very much the language that I think I do see in Sri Lankan civil society, but that is a language of patronage.
Right.
It's not the language of rights and representation, which, however suppressed in other parts of the subcontinent, you see is still at least alive a little. That we fight these battles, and you cannot call, Secretary of State to bail you out of the situation. So there's something going on.
Yeah, that's another interesting thing. I hadn't thought of that as patronage politics, but I suppose it is. Yeah. Maybe it's something about Sri Lanka being such a small place.
Or this impact of the Civil War. The impact of the Civil War was like really under military rule pretty much for so many years since independence.
Yeah. But bringing, in terms of then connecting the question of reconciliation to two questions. The former government talked a lot about, they sent their diplomats and study tours to South Africa. Repeatedly, they would always sort of pull out of their pocket when they came under pressure at various international fora. So, yes, we're going to have a truth commission. Oh, yes, we're going to go to South Africa and study it. And there was a very active South African ambassador, high commissioner in Colombo for many years, who was really trying his best, I think, and was actively encouraging this traffic back and forth. At a certain point, though, he, I think, began to realize it was just for show. Now, the current government has promised the truth commission, but we've yet to, and apparently some very smart, some people I know, very smart lawyers in the government have drafted the truth commission, the law for a truth commission, but no one has seen it other than them. And will it actually ever emerge? Possibly, but possibly not. Now, I think a lot of people have pointed out for years one of your points, which is the South African model is very, very informed by Christian students. Many people said this is something not going to work in Sri Lanka. So others have tried to figure out, well, would there be some way of incorporating some Buddhist ideas? So one idea apparently is to have a sort of, I can't remember what it's called, it's like a religious panel of a multi-religious panel to whom people would testify, sort of as like a first stage, and then after they've kind of done some triage and sort of forgived a few people, or forgived a lot of people, a few would not get forgiven, and they would go off to some legal process. That's one model that's been played with. But of course the the basic difference between South Africa and Sri Lanka is in Sri Lanka the majority was not oppressed and won, whereas in South Africa it was the majority which was oppressed and won, but through a deal where they sort of agreed to be not too harsh on the bruises. So it's so that I think that dynamic would affect whatever would mean that any kind of reconciliation model would have to be quite different. And just to your point, there has been a lot of talk about reconciliation as an alternative to equal justice. My reading, and if you look at the reports that I've worked on for the International Crisis Group, what I think you need is to first focus on those sorts of justice, those cases of crimes, of political crimes under the former regime, which that you could easily come up with a package of cases in which all communities were affected. There were Muslims murdered, there were Sinhalese dissidents and journalists killed, and there were Tamils killed. And you could easily package, a set of crimes, sort of exemplary crimes, in which all communities could see that their issues were being dealt with, their experience was recognized. The culture of impunity, as it's called, which of course is throughout South Asia, you make a dent in that. Perhaps you make a few future disappearers or killers think twice before they pull the trigger. And then if you had done that, maybe then you can get to the harder case, which is the way the war was fought at the very end, large scale civilian casualties there. But I don't think you can begin with that. A lot of people want to begin with that, and I think what we've seen is by beginning with the hardest case, you've played into the hands of the opposition and want nothing to happen.
Can you wait for the mic, please?
So I just have one question about, say, with the current administration, it's sort of this complicated nature. We have the President Sirisena as belonging to the Sri Lankan Freedom Party, and we have the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe who belongs to the UNP. So do you think, because of this, say, do you think if the UNP had complete control of, say, the presidency and the premiership, do you think there would have been more progress in terms of their points, or do you think there is a bit of this influence due to the president belonging to the SLFP and say having to appeal to the SLFP, especially with the Rajapaksa brothers, Lanka and Goldabe and Basil. They're all trying to sort of stick their own they're also trying to fight for control of that party.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask what role the sort of intense militarization of society in the last many years in Sri Lanka has played in the ethnic politics of that country. And I ask in part because we've got Pakistani folks here and Bangladeshis, and there might be some interesting comparative observations.
Yeah. We're trying to get to Sarah.
I thought you might reflect a bit on the nature of the Sri Lankan judiciary, whether it's not one of the strongest judiciaries in the region, or it was elected. How much does that have an effect in thinking about the justice process and ultimately the effectiveness of what's happened so far?
Okay. Well, on the first question, in principle, many people have been hopeful that bringing the two parties together, so Sri Lanka, like a lot of places, has sort of alternated over the years with the slightly right-wing government replacing the slightly left-wing party. So these two parties have battled out, but they aren't really that different, but have slightly different tinges to them. But the problem is that constitutional change in Sri Lanka requires a two-thirds majority of government. So no government has had a two-thirds majority. Briefly, the former Rajapaksa was able, through threats and payoffs, to get a two-thirds majority. But it was very fragile. So this government now, by bringing together both the two parties, has an easy two-thirds majority. So the idea was bring them together for a few years, and you tackle the hard things, a new constitution, greater devolution of power to Tamil areas, a few other tricky things, and then you probably return back to the old style. But And so there's still the chance of that working. So just yesterday, actually, the parliamentary subcommittee that is called the interim, the steering committee of Parliament, acting as the Constitutional Assembly, has just put out its report for a new constitution. So it may be that they're going to finally, what everyone's waiting for the last year or so, will begin to proceed with, actually try to get a new constitution through Parliament. And these two parties working together, or at least tolerating each other, will be absolutely crucial. But in other ways, bringing these two parties together who hate each other, often see things quite differently, have different sort of patronage networks, different constituencies they have to appease, and just having so many people in government means you have to have 100 ministers, and you have to have 100 cars and 100 offices, and raises the costs, produces very inefficient and often incompetent administration. So in that ways, lots of things have not gotten done because you have this cobbled together, this unwieldy beast. But if it actually creates the space for a new constitution to get through, then I think it probably will have been worth it. But the jury is very much out. And on all the other issues, I don't think a strictly, a straight UNP government would probably have been any more proactive on issues of reconciliation, justice. And in fact, most people believe the reason a lot of the cases of corruption and political murders under the old regime, under the Rajapaksa's, have not proceeded, even though the police have actually done some excellent investigations. They're not being, they're not sort of proceeding to the indictment stage. Most people think it's because of the UNP prime minister, who wants to keep the Rajapaksas alive because he wants the SLFP to remain divided between the president's wing and the former president. That's pretty much the consensus of people who know Sri Lankan politics better than I do. So it cuts lots of different directions. Intense militarization. I mean, well, the fact that the military is 99% Sinhalese. It's always been a Sinhala army, a Sinhala navy, a Sinhala air force, and in the immediate aftermath, the northern province, which are overwhelmingly Tamil majority, where the war was principally fought, was I think at some stage a few years ago, it was the most militarized, sort of on a per capita basis, soldier for population of anywhere, including Kashmir. Actually, the numbers that we crunched. It was like 150,000 troops for 1 million people. And that militarization has been slightly reduced, but is still very intense and is a constant irritant to the local population. Breeds contributes to the feeling of Tamils in those areas and Tamils elsewhere that their regions are on the way to being slowly Sinhalized. The army is the first beachhead of Sinhala population moving in. There's been some sign of that happening, not yet to any great extent in terms of numbers. But certainly when an army has a camp, it will build a Buddha statue. And then when you have a Buddha statue, a Buddhist priest will come to tend it. And then with Buddhist priest, maybe he'll have a deputy priest. And then there'll be some families who come. So there's certainly militarization is deeply intertwined with very much the dominance of one community or another. The government has promised to reduce that militarization. They've done it to some degree, but not significantly. And of course, it's quite controversial because the opposition politicians say, you're taking away the military from the areas where the terrorists have operated. You're opening yourself up to a renewal of the insurgency. So small changes have been made, but not very far down the line. On the judiciary, I don't really know comparatively. I mean, they haven't. There was. There's signs of some growing independence. One of the changes 2 years ago, they amended the Constitution to reestablish the independence of certain commissions, including the Judicial Services, which had been heavily politicized for the So over time, perhaps the new judges that come up, there'll be new blood, and some of the older, quite heavily corrupt highly politicized judges will go the lead. There's been some judgments that have been fairly progressive recently. There was a recent judgment having to do with a clause in the Constitution which outlaws any advocacy of a separate state. That was a relatively progressive decision that opened up more space for the Tamil Party to argue its case of federalism. That was from a three-person bench. So there's signs that there's a little bit more space, and I think in general the great achievement over the last couple of years in Sri Lanka is that there is space, greater space for the police to actually investigate cases. Again, they don't yet haven't gotten to the stage of actually filing prosecuting. Space for the media to cover stories that they previously did. More space for activists and to go travel throughout the country, including the Tamil areas which previously were so heavily militarized that it's not safe. So there's been an opening, but it's not yet very deeply institutionalized or very sort of solidly in place. But there has been some progress.
One last question.
Maybe we can squeeze in two. So there was a hand behind me. So I wanted to bring up this issue. I mean, one of the bigger questions I've been asking this morning, Alan, at our opening was this question of the role that international advocacy can play both for good and bad. And certainly today you've emphasized some of the slippages, shall we say diplomatically. But I guess as somebody who works in that arena, can you articulate why there isn't a better alignment between the kinds of projects that European governments want to fund? I mean, it seems like the overall goals are in alignment, but the mechanisms for getting there often don't seem in alignment. So, I mean, I'm really struck by what you're saying is happening as a result of international funding and the absence of penetrating NGOs, in a sense, penetrating into Sri Lankan civil society. And if you can see that, and you can see the absence of the efficacy of that, why can't we, where's the slippage in producing the funding that would promote those kinds of linkages and that kind of work, I guess? Because it sounds like, I think, oftentimes it does feel a little bit to me as an outsider that the tail wags the dog, right? Like, oh, there's this project, and therefore we're going to go for that funding, and then we're going to have to do that, and kind of on the side we'll do what we really want to do. Right? So that's my question, but maybe I can pass it on. So
I have a question, sort of points at your frame of nationalism. So I don't know if I can phrase this as eloquently as the rest of the people from phrasing their questions, but as far as democracy goes, I want to know why you feel democracy has something to offer for Sri Lanka. Because across South Asia, we've seen the failures of democracy in terms of dominant liberal politics and dominant liberal culture and what it does in terms of equating struggles of a dominant majority and their relations to nationalism that's rooted in ethno-linguistics or that's rooted in response to oppression and oppressive structures. So.
Big one. Well, I once wrote a book about democracy, so I should be able to answer that question. I have something to say. But I mean, I would say, democracy isn't just electoral democracy. It's certainly not normatively speaking about the rule of the majority, except if there are sort of protections of enough protections of those who lose, whether they lose because they're some kind of ascriptive community in an ethno-national community or for some other reason. That there are certain protections, so you have certain rights that are protected. But of course, maintaining those protections in the face of a majority who, as long as the majority is voting on ethno-national lines, and as long as that their ethnos makes up the majority, then they can keep on winning and they can keep on changing the rules in their favor, and that's obviously happened lots of places. So I think so as I imagine democracy, it's a slightly different model. It would certainly be about maintaining equality across multiple vectors, and even in the when you lose, you don't lose everything, right? You have certain rights protected, certain guarantees of equal treatment under the law, or in terms of resources or so forth. But it also be democratic by sort of seeing shared concerns across these, and often at odds with ethnic identification. So that requires cultivation. That requires hard political work of trying to persuade people of what they have in common, or how they could both win if they approach things differently. And that's what I don't see that happening so much in Toronto. I don't see it happening a lot of places. But I think there are a lot of. So what I was just saying in terms of sort of picking us, had the government picked a certain set of legal cases, of criminal cases, in which all communities were victims and all communities would see their benefit, you would begin to you'd be framing things in a way that was not about one community winning and another community losing. So I think there are other battles and other ways of framing things, including through economic justice, social and economic rights. There's as some of my friends point out to me, then there's land struggles in Tamil areas, there's land struggles in Muslim areas, and there's land struggles in Sinhalese areas. But there's very little work in the name of defending our land rights across Sri Lanka. Partly because of what I didn't mention, but maybe it's obvious. Most Tamils speak only Tamil. Virtually all Sinhalese speak only Sinhalese. Muslims tend to be mostly Tamil speaking, but often fairly multilingual. But the communities live in different worlds. They listen to different radio stations, they read different magazines, and so there's a practical problem about organizing people together across ethnic lines, but it's across linguistic lines as well. But I think you can imagine a sort of democratic struggles that are about defending shared rights, including socioeconomic rights, that would begin to sort of, make it, would begin to then affect electoral democracy and how parties vote. Slightly de-emphasize that as well. In terms of the funding issue, it's a big problem in a lot of places. I do think, I'm not sure. I certainly don't have the answer, but I do think there is this problem of projects. How funding projects get. The funding project that emerges on someone's desk in Colombo, on an NGO's desk, as a sort of a call for tenders, or a call for applications, has gone through a very long, complicated chain. It started in some room in Brussels, right? A number of people, bureaucrats meeting, they figure out how much money they have, think about what are the priorities of the European Parliament for that year, and the Commission, and there's lots of complicated negotiation, and then they think about who they have working in Colombo. Oh, they're good at that, so that's all these different factors that come together, and it's not generally, it might hopefully overlap to some degree with the needs and the interests of people in Sri Lanka, but there's no guarantee that overlap will be considerable. So, but changing that beast is a tall order that I'm sure many people in this room have struggled with. I don't have the answer.
Thank you.